The gun was already drawn before the horse had fully stopped, and Delia Sutton did not flinch. She stood in the middle of the dirt road with her carpetbag clutched to her chest, and her chin raised at an angle that dared the universe to throw one more catastrophe at her. Dust swirled around her boots, the afternoon sun hammering down on the Nevada plain with the kind of merciless heat that felt personal. Behind her, 3 miles back, was the smoldering wreckage of the stagecoach. Beside her was nothing but open land in every direction, a brutal emptiness stretching toward mountains that looked close enough to touch and were probably 2 days' walk away. The rider had come out of that emptiness like something conjured, a dark silhouette dropping down from a ridge she hadn't even noticed. And now he sat astride a black horse that was breathing hard but holding perfectly still. The gun was holstered before she realized she'd misjudged the motion of his hand. He hadn't drawn on her. He'd drawn and reholstered in the same fluid second, a reflex she couldn't interpret. His eyes were scanning the road behind her, then the ridge, then the scrub brush to either side, moving the way a man's eyes move when he has been hunted enough times to know the shape of danger in a landscape. Then he looked at her. She had a bruise forming along her jaw from where the coach had rolled. Her dress was torn at the hem and her hair had come completely undone from its pins, hanging loose and dark around her shoulders. She looked, she was certain, like a woman the world had recently discarded. But she did not look away from him, and she did not take a single step backward. He was younger than the hat, and the coat and the dangerous stillness suggested. Hard-jawed, with dark eyes set under straight brows, wearing trail dust the way other men wore Sunday clothes. A rifle sat in the scabbard alongside the saddle. 2 revolvers on his belt, a scar along his left hand that caught the light as he rested it on the saddle horn and studied her with an expression that was impossible to read. "A woman like you," he said, and his voice was low and deliberate, shaped by 1,000 miles of empty country, should not walk alone. Delia Sutton exhaled through her nose. She had been told a great many things by a great many men in her 26 years, and almost none of them had turned out to be as simple as they sounded. She looked at the horse, then at the road behind her, then at the man who was watching her with something that was not quite pity and not quite interest, but was positioned somewhere between those two things in a territory she did not have a name for yet. "I am aware of that," she said. Unfortunately, awareness and options are not the same thing. He said nothing for a moment. The horse shifted. The wind moved through the dry grass. "Get up," he said finally, and reached down his hand. She had not reached this road, this particular catastrophe, this extraordinary loneliness by trusting men on horseback who appeared from ridges without warning. But she had also not survived 26 years by being rigid when the situation demanded something else. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She made the calculation that people in impossible circumstances make, the one that is less about certainty and more about odds. She took his hand. 3 weeks earlier, Delia Sutton had been standing in the kitchen of her late husband's house in Carson City, Nevada, receiving the news that the house, the business, and every dollar she believed to be hers was not, in any legal sense, hers at all. Her husband, Franklin Sutton, had died 6 weeks before that. He had died owing money to a man named Owen Vance, a creditor, a land speculator, a person who occupied the fringes of legitimate society in the way that rats occupied the fringes of a barn, visible enough to acknowledge, too useful to entirely remove. Franklin had borrowed from Voss to expand his freighting business, had signed papers that Delia had never seen, and had died before the debt came due, leaving the debt and the collateral in Delia's hands. The collateral was everything. She had stood in her kitchen and listened to Voss's lawyer explain this to her with the smooth, practiced sympathy of a man who had done it many times before. And she had felt something shift inside her that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but contained elements of both. Franklin had not been a cruel man. He had been a careless one, which in some ways was worse, because cruelty at least implied intention. He had simply not thought about what would happen to her. He had not thought about it at all. She had 30 days to vacate. She had a sister in a town called Redemption, Wyoming, which told you everything you needed to know about the kind of town that required naming. Her sister, Alina, had married a rancher named Thomas Hale 3 years ago, and while Delia and Alina had not been close since childhood in the way they had once been, close in the way of shared beds and shared secrets, the letter Alina had written when Franklin died had been genuinely warm. "Come out," Alina had written. "Come stay while you find your feet. Thomas won't mind. He is a good man and there is room." Delia had written back and said she might take Alina up on that. She had not written that she would be arriving with nothing but a carpet bag and a jaw bruised by a stagecoach accident. She had not written that the route from Carson City to Redemption, Wyoming in the autumn of 1876, required 2 coach transfers and a stretch of road through southern Nevada that was, by most accounts, spectacularly inhospitable. She had not written that the second coach would roll on a curve outside a nothing town called Harrow Flats when the lead horse spooked at a rattlesnake, sending 2 passengers to the doctor, one to immediate burial, and Delia into the dirt with her carpetbag somehow still in her arms, her ribs aching, and the driver announcing through blood-caked lips that there would be no replacement coach for 4 days. She could not wait for days. Harlan Voss's men had been asking about her in Carson City before she left. She had seen one of them at the depot when she boarded the first coach, a thick-necked man named Cutter who worked for Voss the way a hammer worked for a carpenter, without conscience and without preference. She did not know what Voss wanted with her specifically, given that he already had everything of value. But men like Voss, in her experience, were not satisfied by having everything. They needed to be certain that the person they had taken it from understood the completeness of their defeat. She was not interested in providing that understanding, so she had walked. The rider's name was Owen Vance, and he did not offer it immediately. For the first mile he rode and she sat behind him on the black horse, whose name she would eventually learn was Cormac, and they did not speak. She held the saddle roll behind her rather than his waist, because she did not know him, and he seemed to accept this with the same wordless neutrality with which he accepted most things. The road unspooled ahead of them, pale and cracked. The mountains began, very slowly, to change their shape. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Redemption, Wyoming." A pause. "That is not close, I am aware." Another pause longer. "You came from the direction of Harrow Flats." The coach rolled. He did not express surprise at this. He did not express much of anything that was expressible. He simply absorbed the information and kept riding. And Delia found herself studying the back of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse with the ease of a man who had been doing it since before he could remember, loose and balanced, and somehow both relaxed and entirely alert. "There is a town called Bitter Creek," he said. 8 miles north. I can take you there." "What is in Bitter Creek?" "A hotel, a telegraph office, a stage that runs to the railhead at Elko on Thursdays." What day is it? He thought about it. Tuesday. 2 days. 2 days in Bitter Creek with Cutter potentially behind her and Voss's reach extending in directions she couldn't predict. But 2 days was better than 4, and a hotel was better than a road, and the railhead at Elko was infinitely better than either. "All right," she said. "Owen Vance," she learned over those 8 miles, was not a man who volunteered information. He answered questions in the most economical way possible, offered nothing beyond what was asked, and seemed to exist in a state of sustained self-sufficiency that was either deeply impressive or deeply sad, depending on the angle from which you examined it. She learned that he was heading north himself, though she could not determine why. She learned that he had come from Arizona, though she could not determine what had taken him there. She learned that his horse was 4 years old, that he had owned it for 3 of those years, and that its temperament was, in his assessment, reliable, which she suspected was the highest praise he extended to anyone or anything. She did not learn his name until they stopped at a creek to let the horse drink, and he handed her his canteen without being asked, and she said, "Thank you. I should tell you my name is Delia Sutton," and he said, after a moment that felt like it contained a small deliberation, "Owen Vance." She turned the name over in her mind. It was a plain, solid name. It suited him. "Are you a gunfighter?" she asked, because she was not someone who danced around the obvious. "I have been," he said. He was crouched by the creek, water running over his hands, and he did not look at her when he said it. "Are you one now?" "That is a more complicated question." She watched him. He had pushed his hat back slightly, and she could see him more clearly in the afternoon light. The line of his jaw, the way something sat behind his eyes that was heavier than his years should have produced. He was 29, she would later learn. He looked, in certain lights, considerably older than that. "You can tell me it is none of my business," she said. "It is none of your business," he said, but without hostility, more like a man citing a fact. "But the answer is that I am trying to be done with it." She understood then, something about the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned and his hand rested near his belt even when there was nothing to scan for. He was a man in the process of exiting a version of himself, and that process was neither clean nor fast. She recognized the shape of it because she was in a similar process herself, though the version she was exiting was less dramatic. She was exiting the version that had believed Franklin Sutton would take care of things. They reached Bitter Creek as the sun was beginning its long drop toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that were extraordinary and wasted on a town of 40 people. The main street was 2 blocks of wooden buildings, a church at one end, a saloon at the other, with a hotel called the Meridian sandwiched between a dry goods store and what appeared to be a dentist's office, identified by a painted sign featuring a tooth that had been rendered with more optimism than skill. Owen stopped the horse in front of the Meridian and swung down, then reached up for her carpet bag before she could manage to dismount on her own. "You do not need to carry that," she said. "I am aware," he said, in such an exact echo of her own phrasing from the road that she looked at him sharply, but his face was neutral, and she could not tell if it was deliberate. The hotel had a room. It was small and square and smelled of wood and dust, and something faintly floral that had been applied to the curtains at some point in the past and had nearly, but not entirely, faded. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the alley between the Meridian and the dry goods store. It was, by every objective measure, adequate. Delia paid for 2 nights with money she had been rationing carefully since Carson City, watched the coins disappear into the desk clerk's hand with the familiar anxiety of someone whose reserves were not replenishing, and then turned to find that Owen Vance was still standing in the lobby with her carpetbag in his hand. "You will want to eat," he said. "I will," she agreed. "The saloon serves food at 6. It is better than it sounds." She looked at him. He was looking somewhere slightly past her at the wall or the window or the concept of food at 6, she couldn't tell. "Are you offering to join me?" She asked, a pause. If you are not opposed. She thought about it. She was, on balance, not opposed. She was, if she was being honest, the opposite of opposed, and that fact was interesting enough that she filed it away to examine later, when she was alone with the floral curtains and her own thoughts. I am not opposed, she said. He nodded and handed her the carpet bag, and that was how it started. The saloon, which was called the Horseshoe, was loud enough in the evenings to provide a kind of privacy within the noise. Owen chose a table against the back wall, which placed his back against the wood and his eyes on the door, and she noted this without commenting on it. They ordered the beef stew, which arrived in heavy crockery bowls with bread that was 2 days old but still adequate, and coffee that was fresh and strong. He ate with the efficient, unadorned focus of a man who did not regard meals as social occasions. But he did not ignore her. He listened, she discovered, with a quality of attention that was unusual in her experience of men, which was that he actually listened, without preparing his response while she spoke, without steering the conversation back to himself, without performing interest while practicing absence. She told him about the coach accident. Then, because the coffee was strong and she was tired in a way that made her less guarded than usual, she told him about the lawyer in her kitchen, and the papers she had never seen, and the 30 days that had turned her life into something she didn't recognize. He did not offer her sympathy, which she appreciated, because sympathy from strangers had a texture that she found difficult to absorb without irritation. What he did, instead, was ask 2 or 3 precise questions that indicated he had actually understood the mechanics of what she described, and then he said, "Voss. Is that his name?" "Harlan Voss," she said. "Do you know him?" Something moved through his expression, there and gone before she could fully identify it. "I know the name," he said. "Nevada landmen. He has been expanding north." "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "I spent 3 years working protection on the Comstock," he said finally. "Bodyguard work, for men who needed to know about other men like Voss." "For men like Voss," she said, and it was not a question exactly. "Yes," he said, with the evenness of someone who had made his peace with a truth that was not comfortable. "For men like Voss, which is part of why I am heading north and trying to be done with it." She looked at him across the scarred wooden table, in the lamplight and noise of the Horseshoe Saloon, and felt something shift in her chest that was distinct from the shifts she had been feeling for months. The grief-adjacent feelings about Franklin, the fear-adjacent feelings about Voss, the loss-adjacent feelings about the house in Carson City. This was different. This was something that required acknowledgement even if she was not prepared to give it. "That is a dark past to be carrying," she said. "It is," he agreed without defensiveness or self-pity. "Just agreement. Just the plain acknowledgement of a true thing. And you are just walking away from it." "Riding," he said. She almost laughed. She did not quite, but the almost was visible enough that his expression shifted in a way that might, by some generous interpretation, be called a beginning of a smile. "Where north?" she asked. "Montana Territory. I have a cousin who runs cattle near the Yellowstone. He has been asking me to come for 2 years. And you are going now." "I am going now." She thought about that. Montana Territory, Redemption, Wyoming. These were not, geographically, the same place, but they were arranged along a general northward direction, and the space between them, she realized, was not a wall but a question. She did not ask the question. It was too early and she was too careful, and he was, despite the evening and the coffee and the listening, still a stranger with a scarred hand and guns on his belt and a past that was, by his own assessment, dark. But she thought about it. She thought about it considerably. The next morning she was at the telegraph office at 8 o'clock, sending a wire to a leaner in redemption. The telegraph operator, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the eager manner of someone who processed other people's urgent communication as a form of entertainment, took her message and repeated it back to her with a slight tonal interest that she found intrusive. On her way back to the Meridian, she passed the dry goods store and stopped because in the window there was a display of preserved food, and she realized she had eaten almost nothing since the previous evening, and the stew had been good but the bread had been old, and she was, at this moment, genuinely hungry in a way that felt entirely manageable if she simply addressed it. She was standing at the counter inside, looking at what was available and calculating against what she could spend, when the door opened behind her, and the shape of the man who entered fell across the wooden floor in a way that was recognizable even before she turned. It was not Cutter. It was someone she did not know, but who had the particular bearing of a man doing someone else's business. He looked at her with the practiced assessment of a person comparing a face to a description, and she felt the cold recognition of being found move through her before she had consciously identified why. She did not run. Running was conspicuous, and she was 300 miles from Carson City, and she had done nothing wrong legally, and she had no reason to believe that whatever this man wanted from her was any more threatening than Voss's lawyer had been in her kitchen. She bought a small slab of dried beef and a heel of bread and walked out of the store without looking at the man again. Owen was at the stable behind the hotel, doing something to Cormac's left front shoe that involved a conversation with the farrier, a wide, sunburned man named Gus who spoke about horses with the reverence usually reserved for religious subjects. Owen looked up when she appeared at the stable door. She did not say anything dramatic. She said, "There is a man at the dry goods store who was looking at me in a way I do not like." He straightened. He did not ask her to elaborate on the looking, which she appreciated, because it was the kind of thing that was sometimes difficult to explain to people who had not experienced being looked at that way. He simply said, "Describe him," and she did, and he listened. "Voss's?" he asked. "I think so." "I cannot be certain." He looked past her at the alley, then at Cormac, then at her. "How important is it that you leave today rather than Thursday?" "Considerably," she said. He nodded. He said something to Gus that involved payment and thanks, and then he turned back to her and said, "Get your bag. We will ride to Elko. It is longer, but there are 2 roads and we can take the one that is not watched." She looked at him. "You do not have to do this." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to." "I know that too." She studied his face and found in it nothing that suggested obligation or performance or hidden motive. What she found was something simpler and more difficult to categorize, the particular expression of a man who has decided to do a thing because doing it is the correct thing to do, and whose sense of what is correct is not negotiable. "I will get my bag," she said. They left Bitter Creek by the western road, and then turned north on a track that was more suggestion than road, following a dry wash that Owen said connected, eventually, to the main trail to Elko without crossing through any of the obvious checkpoints. He knew this country in the way that people knew things they'd had reason to know under pressure, not from maps but from necessity. She rode behind him again, and this time, without thinking about it, she placed her hands against his sides rather than the saddle roll, because the track was rougher and the horse was moving faster, and it was the practical choice. He did not react to this. But she felt something in his posture, a small adjustment, almost like a breath he had not known he was holding. They rode for 6 hours with one stop at a creek and one stop when Owen pulled up suddenly, held up his hand, and sat completely still for 45 seconds while his eyes moved across the ridge to the east. She held her breath. Then he relaxed marginally and said, "Pronghorn," and they continued. "You thought it was a man," she said. "I thought it might be." "Does that happen often, that you look at a ridge and think it might be a man?" A pause. Yes, she considered this. The particular loneliness of being a person who looked at the world and saw, first and reflexively, the shape of potential threat. She thought about her own life, the years of reading rooms and expressions and the subtle signals of men whose intentions were not stated plainly. And she thought that perhaps they were not so different in the fundamental practice, only in the domain of it. "My husband never thought about things like that," she said, and then wasn't sure why she'd said it. "What did he think about? Business, routes, freight manifests?" She paused. "He was not a bad man. He was just thoroughly occupied by things that were not me." Owen said nothing. The horse's hooves moved steadily over the dry ground. "I was not miserable," she said, because she wanted to be accurate. "I was just alone inside a life that looked, from the outside, like I was not alone. That is a different thing from misery. It is its own specific category of unhappiness." "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." She wondered then what life he had been referring to. She did not ask. But she stored the answer in the part of her that was beginning to build a picture of him, detail by detail. The way you build a picture of something you are looking at through fog, where each step forward resolves something that was previously indistinct. They reached Elko the following evening, having camped one night in the open, a fact which Delia approached with pragmatism, and Owen with a consideration that involved him sleeping on the other side of the fire and handing her his coat when the desert night turned cold without being asked, then wrapping himself in his bedroll with the equanimity of a man who found the cold objectively preferable to the alternative. She lay in his coat, which smelled of leather and horses and wood smoke, and looked at the stars above the Nevada desert, which were, without the competition of lamplight, frankly extraordinary. She thought about the fact that 24 hours ago she had been standing on a road with everything she owned in a bag and a bruised jaw, and that now she was lying under the Nevada stars with a coat that belonged to a man she had known for 36 hours and could not stop thinking about. This was not, she acknowledged, entirely rational, but it was real. And she had learned over 26 years that real things and rational things occupied different territories, and that pretending otherwise was a form of dishonesty she had no patience for. She fell asleep before she could examine the feeling further, which was probably for the best. In the morning, he made coffee on the small fire and handed her a cup before he had one himself, and when she thanked him he said nothing, just looked at her briefly with those dark eyes over the rim of his own cup, and the look said something that she didn't have words for yet. Elko, in 1876, was a rail town, a relatively recent eruption of commerce and noise along the Central Pacific Line, and it had the particular energy of places that exist primarily as points of transition, everyone moving through, no one quite arrived. The railroad station occupied the center of things, steam and smell, and the tremendous mechanical urgency of trains that had somewhere important to be. Owen took her to the station, and they stood at the ticket window, and she bought passage to Cheyenne, Wyoming, which was the closest station to redemption. She counted out the money with the careful attention of someone who knows they are nearly at the end of what they have. And Owen watched this without commenting. When she turned from the window, she found him standing with his hat in his hands, which she had not seen him do before. It made him look younger. It made him look like someone who was about to say something he had been deliberating over and had not yet decided how to phrase. "The train to Cheyenne stops in Ogden," he said. The connection north to Montana goes from Ogden. She looked at him. The station was loud around them, bells and voices and the hiss of steam. You are going the same direction, she said, for a portion of it. She thought about what it meant that he was telling her this. He was not asking her anything. He was simply offering a fact and allowing her to do with it what she chose, which was, she was learning his characteristic mode. He did not impose. He offered clearly and without expectation, and then waited. Then perhaps we will share a car as far as Ogden, she said. The tension in his shoulders, which she had learned to read as a very small thing, eased by approximately 1/4 of what it might have been capable of easing. That would be acceptable, he said, which was not, she suspected, the entire truth of what he was feeling. She did not tell him that it would be more than acceptable. She just walked toward the platform and allowed him to fall into step beside her, and in the station noise and steam she thought, with a clarity that felt almost alarming, that she had not felt this much like herself in years. The train was 3 hours late, because trains in 1876 were frequently 3 hours late, for reasons ranging from cattle on the tracks to mechanical failings that were addressed with the kind of improvised engineering that either worked perfectly or resulted in the train stopping again, 14 miles further along. They waited on the platform, and then, when the platform became too hot, in the station building, which was too crowded but had the advantage of shade, they talked. Not with the careful interrogative structure of the previous day, but with the easier rhythm of people who have passed through a threshold of familiarity and come out the other side into something more natural. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her parents who ran a hardware store, about a leaner who had been the pretty one and herself who had been the one with opinions. He told her, slowly and with the particular carefulness of someone touching something that is still sore, about growing up in Texas, about a father who was absent and a mother who was formidably capable, about leaving at 17 because there was nothing to stay for and everything else in the world to find. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Some of it," he said. "The wrong parts first." "That tends to be how it works." "It does," he agreed. "The wrong parts are usually louder, more visible, easier to fall into." She thought about Franklin, about the way she had married him at 22, with the logic of a woman who had been told that a husband was the next step, and a freighting business was solid and Carson City was a growing town. All of that was true. None of it was wrong exactly. It had just been quiet in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I think I made the wrong choice early too," she said. "Not the wrong person exactly, just the wrong reasons. And after a while the reasons are the foundation, and if the foundation is wrong then everything built on it is a little uncertain, even if it looks fine." He looked at her steadily. "And now?" he asked. "Now I have nothing to build on," she said, "which is terrifying. But it is also the first time in 4 years that every decision I make is genuinely mine." Something in his expression changed in a way she could not have fully described, but it was the look of a man who has recognized something, the look you give a landscape you have been in before, not with your body but with your understanding. "Yes," he said quietly, "that is exactly what it is." The train came. They found seats in a car that smelled of coal smoke and old upholstery, and for a while they watched the Nevada desert move past the window in the particular way that landscapes move when you are traveling fast, the foreground rushing and the distant mountains holding still with the patience of things that have been there longer than people. At some point, without either of them acknowledging it, her shoulder had come to rest against his upper arm. She felt him become still in that way he had, that quality of complete physical attention, and then he relaxed into the contact, and they remained like that as the last of Nevada gave way to the beginning of Utah, and the light changed. She fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere outside Wendover. She knew this because she woke up still against his shoulder, and he was awake, looking out the window, and when she lifted her head, he looked down at her with an expression of such unguarded, undisguised warmth that it startled her into complete alertness. He looked away immediately, as if he'd shown her something inadvertently. She sat up and smoothed her dress and looked at the passing landscape and thought about that expression for the rest of the journey to Ogden. Ogden was where things became complicated. They pulled into the station in the early evening, and the plan, such as it was, had been simple. She would take the connection east to Cheyenne. He would take the connection north to Montana, and they would have done each other a service and parted with goodwill, and whatever was accumulating between them would be filed away in the category of things that almost happened and didn't. Except that at the Ogden station, waiting on the platform with the patience of someone who has been waiting for a while, was Cutter. Delia saw him before he saw her. She had the instinct of someone who had been watching for him since Carson City, and her eyes moved across crowds with the particular efficiency of someone who knows the specific shape of the person they are afraid of. She pulled back from the car doorway before she stepped down, and she said very quietly to Owen, who was directly behind her, the thick man in the brown coat, left side of the platform. Owen looked over her head, a moment of stillness. He followed the telegraph wire, he said. Elko to Ogden is a logical route. He would have sent word ahead. The word ahead implication meant there were others, possibly others she didn't know to look for. I cannot let him find me here, she said. If he gets Voss's people between me and Cheyenne, I cannot reach a leaner. Owen's hand came to her arm, light and brief. Step back into the car, he said. I will look. She stepped back. Owen came back. Two of them, he said. One I recognized from Carson City, from Nevada in general. He worked the mines. He looked at her with a directness that felt like honesty being offered with both hands. Delia, I need to tell you something. She braced herself. In her experience, that sentence had preceded several varieties of unwelcome information. The man in gray, he said. His name is Mick Selden. I worked alongside him for 6 months on the Comstock. He is not a violent man by nature. He is a man who does what he is paid to do and nothing beyond it. What that means is that Voss's instructions to them are specific. What are the instructions likely to be? Owen's jaw was set. To bring you back to Carson City, Voss will want to settle whatever he believes is unfinished. I have nothing he has not already taken. He may not believe that. She thought about what else Voss might believe she had. The papers. The originals of the loan documents, the ones that his lawyer had presented to her in copies. Franklin had kept papers in a lockbox, the lockbox that had been inventoried along with everything else when the debt was assessed. But she had taken a specific envelope from that lockbox before the lawyer arrived, because she had seen it when Franklin died, and she had put it in her carpetbag against a future she could not predict. She had not opened it. She had not needed to, yet. She looked at Owen and said, there may be documents, Franklin's documents, that Voss wants. Ah, said Owen. I did not know they were significant. I took them because they were the only things of Franklin's I had left. Are they in your bag? Yes. Owen was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was working something out. Then he said, there is another train, northbound, leaves in 40 minutes. It stops in Pocatello, and from Pocatello, there is a road connection southeast to Soda Springs, and from Soda Springs you can hire a coach that goes to Cokeville, Wyoming, and Cokeville is 40 miles from Redemption. That is a longer way. It is a way they are not watching, he said. Because it ends in Montana. She looked at him. The train car was quiet around them, the other passengers filing out. "You would miss your connection," she said. "My cousin's cattle will still be there," he said. She felt the thing in her chest that had been there since the road outside Harrow Flats, the thing she had been filing away and examining and not naming, suddenly become too large to file. She looked at Owen Vance with the clear, ruthless honesty of a woman who had spent too long being imprecise about her own interior life, and said to herself, with the directness of someone reading a simple sentence, "I am falling in love with this man." She did not say this out loud. She said instead, "All right, the northbound train." They left the Ogden station without being seen, slipping out through a freight entrance that Owen found with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who always located alternate exits on principle. And they were on the northbound train with 12 minutes to spare. She did not breathe fully until the train was moving. Owen sat across from her this time because the car was arranged differently, and he watched her with a steadiness that she was beginning to understand was not surveillance but something else, the watching of a person who finds the watched person worth watching. "Open the envelope," he said. Not a command. A suggestion, the way you suggest someone eat when they are forgetting to. She had been thinking the same thing. She took the carpet bag from under the seat and removed the envelope, which was thick and sealed with wax and had Franklin's handwriting on the front, which said only for Delia in the event of. She broke the seal. Inside were 5 pages. The first was a letter from Franklin, handwritten, dated 2 months before he died, which meant he had known he was sick before he told her. She read the first paragraph and felt the old grief move through her, clean and uncomplicated, the grief for the man he had been, the man who had tried to be thoughtful at the end even when it was too late to be thoughtful in the ways that mattered. The remaining 4 pages were a second set of loan documents, different from the ones Voss's lawyer had presented. These were the originals, signed by both Franklin and Voss, and they contained a clause that the copies had not. A clause that established the property as collateral only in the event of default without notification, and they specified a notification requirement of 60 days written notice before any foreclosure action could be taken. Voss's lawyer had given her 30 days. She looked up from the pages. Owen was watching her face, reading whatever was on it. "He gave me 30 days, she said. "The contract required 60 in writing." Owen leaned forward slightly. "The original contract, yes." "Then the foreclosure was invalid," he said. She sat with this for a moment. The train moved. Outside, the Utah landscape darkened into evening. "I would need a lawyer," she said. "A real one, not one of Voss's people." "There are lawyers in Cheyenne who are not Voss's people," Owen said. "And there are federal judges who have been watching Voss for reasons that have nothing to do with your particular situation." "How do you know that?" He looked at his hands. "Because the man I worked for on the Comstock," he said slowly, "was not a man like Voss. He was a man who was trying to build a case against men like Voss. I spent 3 years collecting information. I left because it was beginning to cost things I was not willing to pay, but I have names, federal contacts. People who would want to know about a 60-day clause that was deliberately ignored." She stared at him. "I was not going to tell you this," he said, "because it is the kind of information that comes with complications, and I was trying to be done with complications. But you are telling me now." "You are holding the document," he said. "The complications found you. It seems only fair to tell you what I know." She looked at him for a long time in the dimming light of the train car. This man who was trying to be done with his dark past, and was somehow, by the particular mechanics of fate or coincidence, or whatever one preferred to call the random arrangements of the universe, perfectly positioned to help her address hers. "We are a remarkable coincidence," she said. "Perhaps," he said, and then quieter, "or perhaps it is not coincidence." She felt the warmth move through her from the center outward. She held it. She did not look away from him. "Owen," she said. "Yes. I need you to know something." She folded the pages carefully and placed them back in the envelope. "I am not a woman who does things by halves. If I feel something, I feel it completely, and I am not interested in pretending otherwise. I have been pretending otherwise for long enough that I am very done with it." He was very still. Outside, the first stars were appearing. "I feel something," she said plainly, "toward you. I have since approximately the second hour I knew you, which is fast, and I acknowledge that, but it is also true, and I am not going to pretend it is not." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had entirely misread the situation, if the warmth in his expressions and the way he had given her his coat, and missed his connection and located freight exits, had all been the natural behavior of a decent man, and nothing specific about her. Then he said, "I have been trying to think of the right time to say the same thing." He looked up from his hands to her face. "There was not a right time. There kept not being a right time. And I was afraid that if I waited for one, you would arrive in Wyoming and I would continue to Montana, and there would be no more time at all." She breathed. "Then it is fortunate that we are both on a train that is going the wrong direction," she said. Something shifted completely in his face, the last of the distance closing, and he said, "Yes, I have been thinking that myself." They reached Pocatello 2 days later, traveling through country that grew greener and stranger as it went north. And at the Pocatello station, Delia sent a telegram to Alina explaining the route change and the delay. She sent another to a lawyer in Cheyenne, whose name Owen provided, explaining the documents and asking for a consultation. The lawyer's return telegram, arriving before they left Pocatello, was 3 lines long and said, "This is significant. Come directly." She showed it to Owen and he read it twice and said, "The complications I mentioned." "Are you staying?" she asked. It was the most direct question she had asked him. She had been circling it for 2 days, since the train car in Utah, and she asked it now standing on the Pocatello platform with afternoon sun on the wooden boards and a west wind coming down from the mountains. He looked at her steadily. "Where you go," he said, "I will go." It was simply and completely said. It was not dramatic because he was not a dramatic man, but the plainness of it made it more, not less. She felt it in her sternum. "Montana can wait," she said. "My cousin has been asking me for 2 years," he said. "He can ask a while longer." She reached out and took his hand, the one with the scar, and held it. He turned his hand over and held hers back, and they stood like that on the platform in the Idaho afternoon sun, which was, as far as either of them was concerned, the beginning of everything. The road from Soda Springs to Cokeville took them through country that was beautiful in the complicated way of high country, treeless and wind scoured and enormous against the sky. And they hired a coach that smelled of old canvas and moved with a deliberate rocking motion that was easier on the nerves than the rolling variety. They shared the coach with a ranching couple named August and Vera Connell, who were in their 60s and had been married for 40 years, and who regarded Owen and Delia with the frank, cheerful appraisal of people who recognized something in an early stage and enjoyed watching it. Vera asked Delia within the first 10 minutes where they were going. "Wyoming," Delia said, "my sister's place, and then to Cheyenne. For legal business." "And he," Vera nodded at Owen. "He is coming with me," Delia said, and felt how naturally it came out, as if it had always been the arrangement. Vera looked at Owen, who met the look with his characteristic level gaze. "Good," Vera said simply. She should not travel alone. Owen glanced at Delia. and the look they exchanged was private and warm, containing the echo of the road outside Harrow Flats and everything that had come after. And Delia thought that she had never before experienced the particular pleasure of sharing a private understanding with someone, the specific intimacy of a look that was a conversation. Cokeville to Redemption was the last leg. A hired wagon driven by a taciturn man named Hal who asked no questions and required no conversation. And they arrived in Redemption, Wyoming, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks after Delia had walked out of the house in Carson City with her carpetbag, and her bruised jaw and her terrible odds. Alina was standing on the porch of the ranch house when the wagon pulled up, and she looked at her sister, and then at the man beside her sister, and then back at her sister, with the expression of a woman who had been expecting one piece of information and received two. Delia climbed down, and Alina came down the steps, and they held each other on the path between the fence and the porch, and Alina smelled the same as she always had, which was something that Delia had not been prepared for, and she held on for a moment longer than she needed to. "You have a bruise," Alina said, pulling back. "It has nearly faded," Delia said. "Who is this?" Alina looked at Owen, who had climbed down from the wagon and was standing with his hat in his hands again at a respectful distance. "This is Owen Vance," Delia said. "He is the reason I arrived at all rather than somewhere considerably worse." Alina looked at him. Owen nodded, something between a greeting and an acknowledgement. Alina looked back at Delia and said very quietly, "Is he staying?" "Yes," Delia said. Alina nodded as if this had been confirmed. "Thomas will want to meet him," she said. "Come inside." Thomas Hale was everything Alina's letter had promised, and then some. A broad, slow-spoken man with a rancher's hands, and the particular patience of someone who had learned that most things worked out if you gave them adequate time. He shook Owen's hand and assessed him with the methodical thoroughness of a man who was deciding whether this person was going to be a problem, and apparently concluded that he was not, because he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, gave one to Owen, and said, "So you're a gunfighter." "I was," Owen said. Thomas nodded. "I've had 2 of those pass through in the last 5 years looking for work. Good men, both of them. Better horsemen than cowhands, but they learned." He drank. "You looking for work?" Owen looked at Delia briefly. "I am looking to stay in this part of the country for a while," he said carefully. "After that, I expect to reassess." Thomas looked between them with the direct perception of a man who did not miss things. "Fair enough," he said. "Room in the bunkhouse if you need it." "Alina's been asking me to hire an extra hand for the fall roundup anyhow," Owen said. "I am obliged." And that was, as simply as that, how Owen Vance came to be a working ranch hand in Redemption, Wyoming, which was not what either of them had planned, and was, simultaneously, exactly what needed to happen. Cheyenne was 9 days away by coach, and they needed to get there with the documents, and before they went, Delia needed to understand what she had and what it could do. Owen spent the first evening at the ranch going through his mental inventory of contacts and writing names in a small leather notebook with the focused expression of a man doing a thing that was painful but necessary, the deliberate reopening of a period of his life that he had been trying to close. She sat with him at the kitchen table and watched him do it, because Alina had offered privacy and she had accepted the offer, and then found that she did not want it, that the thing she wanted was to sit with this person while he did the work. She made coffee and he wrote, and at some point she reached across the table and placed her hand over his briefly, and he looked up from the notebook and looked at her with the open, unguarded expression she was beginning to recognize as the truest version of his face, the one under the trail dust and the vigilance. "I am glad," she said, "that your horse stopped on that road. He turned his hand under hers and held it. "So am I," he said. It was not the most complex thing that had passed between them, but it held everything. They left for Cheyenne 6 days after arriving in Redemption, traveling by coach with the envelope in Delia's carpetbag and Owen's notebook in his jacket, and a list of names that represented, between them, the evidence of a pattern that was larger than Delia's particular case and had been building for years. Harlan Voss, it turned out, had done to Delia what he had done to at least 6 others in Nevada and Utah. Presented fraudulent or altered contract copies to widows and small business owners, and taken properties that were not legally available to be taken. The 60-day clause in Franklin's contract was not unique. There were others. Owen knew this because the man he had worked for on the Comstock had been collecting this information for 3 years, building the case that Owen had eventually decided he could not keep building because the cost was too personal. The cost had been, specifically, a woman named Sarah who had decided that a man who spent his days in the company of people like Voss was not a man she could build a life with. He told Delia about Sarah on the coach to Cheyenne, not with sorrow or regret, but with the honesty of someone clearing a record. Sarah had not been wrong, he said. He had been, at the time, exactly what she feared, not because he was ruthless, but because he was becoming inured, developing the professional numbness that proximity to corruption produces in people who are not corrupt themselves. A survival mechanism that reads from the outside, like indifference. "But you left," Delia said. "I left," he agreed. "Too late for Sarah, not too late for me." "And now you are going back into it," she said. "For me," he shook his head. "For the right reasons," he said. "Sarah was right that I was in it for the wrong ones. Proximity, money, the excitement of knowing things. Now I know what I am doing it for." He looked at her steadily. "That is a different thing." She looked at him and thought about the injustice of it, the systematic injustice, the way men like Voss moved through the world and took from people who had less power to resist, and how often those people were women, widows, people whose legal standing was constructed to make them vulnerable. She felt the anger of it alongside the personal injury of it, and she thought that being in it for the right reasons was, in fact, everything. "We do this completely," she said. "Not just my case, all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "That will take longer," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It will." He looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of something large and warm and not entirely sayable. "All right," he said. Cheyenne in 1876 was the capital of Wyoming Territory and had the ambitious, ungainly quality of a place that believed strongly in its own future. Broad streets, the railroad, hotels with carpeted lobbies, and a territorial government that was 3 years away from passing the law that would give Wyoming women the right to serve on juries. The same Wyoming that had, in 1869, been the first territory in the United States to grant women the right to vote, a fact that Delia found quietly and completely significant. The lawyer, whose name was Samuel Garrett, had offices above a hardware store on Warren Avenue, and he was a small, energetic man with quick eyes and an immediate, absolute attention to the documents she placed in front of him. He read every page twice. He looked at Owen's notebook. He asked 17 questions. Then he sat back in his chair and said, "I have been trying to get traction on Voss for 18 months. This is traction." He made copies. He sent wires. He told them to come back the following afternoon. They stayed in Cheyenne in separate rooms at the Interocean Hotel, which had electric lights in the lobby and wallpaper in the rooms, and a dining room that served food of a quality that felt, to Delia, like something she had lost the right to and was now, tentatively, reclaiming. They ate dinner there the first night. at a table with a white cloth and real candles, and Owen looked at his surroundings with the mild, contained astonishment of a man who had been existing in the open country for long enough that indoor luxury required a brief period of readjustment. She told him this. He acknowledged it. "I had rooms in San Francisco once," he said. "For about a month. I was not good at it." "You seem to be managing now," she said. He looked at her across the candlelight. "The company is better," he said. She felt the warmth rise in her face, which was not something she was accustomed to, having spent years successfully maintaining composure. And she thought that this was one of the things he did to her, this specific undoing of the practiced composure she had built against a world that required it. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask." He looked at his wine glass, then at her. "When this is resolved, when Garrett has what he needs and Voss is handled and you are not looking over your shoulder anymore," he paused, "what do you want?" It was the most important question anyone had asked her in years. She sat with it for a moment, giving it the serious attention it deserved. "I want a place that is mine," she said. "Something I built or chose, not something I was handed. I want to be useful in the world in a way that is visible. I want to stop being afraid of the next thing." She looked at him directly. "And I want you to stay." He met her eyes. "Then I will stay," he said simply. "Montana," she said. "I will write to my cousin," he said. "He will understand." She reached across the table and touched his hand, briefly, on the white cloth in the candlelight. And the waiter who passed behind her had the good sense to look somewhere else. Garrett moved faster than either of them expected. He had, as he explained the following afternoon, been building a relationship with the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne for the express purpose of cases like this one. And the documents Delia had provided, combined with the names in Owen's notebook and the corroborating accounts that Garrett had been gathering from other Voss victims, were sufficient to bring a federal investigation. Voss, Garrett explained with the brisk satisfaction of a lawyer for whom this was both professional triumph and personal crusade, had been operating under the assumption that widows and small business owners did not have access to federal lawyers and federal courts. He had been correct about this in most cases. In this case, he was not. It would take months to resolve fully. The property in Carson City would not be returned immediately. There would be depositions and hearings, and the particular tedious machinery of legal process that was slow by design and slightly faster in practice than it was supposed to be. But the 60-day clause was clear. The copies that Voss had presented were fraudulent, a fact that Garrett could demonstrate by comparing the original to the versions Voss's lawyer had used. The immediate effect was an injunction preventing any further sale or transfer of Delia's former properties while the investigation was ongoing, and the filing of charges against Voss for fraud, which removed, in a single morning's paperwork, the thing that Delia had been carrying for 3 months. She stood outside Garrett's office on Warren Avenue in the October afternoon with Owen beside her, and she breathed the Wyoming air, which was cold and clean and tasted of coming winter, and she thought about the fact that she had nothing to be afraid of, which was so unfamiliar as to be almost disorienting. "It is not over," Owen said, reading something in her expression. "No," she agreed, "but it is different." She looked at him. "He has no reason to send men after me anymore. It is all in Garrett's hands and the marshal's hands and the federal court's hands." "Yes." "I am not running anymore," she said. "No," he said. "You are not." She turned to face him fully on the sidewalk, with the Cheyenne wind pulling at her hair and the last of the afternoon light cutting gold across everything. She looked at him and thought about the road outside Harrow Flats, about his voice saying a woman like you should not walk alone, about the 8 miles to Bitter Creek, and the night under the Nevada stars and his coat and the train to Ogden and the envelope, and every small specific thing that had added up, detail by detail, to this moment. "I am in love with you," she said. "I want to say it plainly rather than around the edges of it." He looked at her with the full force of his attention, which was considerable, and said, "I am in love with you. I have been for some time, and I have been thinking about the moment I could say it directly without it being the wrong moment. Is this the right moment?" He looked up and down the Warren Avenue sidewalk with its passing horses and pedestrians and the unremarkable everyday life of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then back at her face. "It is the exactly correct moment," he said. She stepped forward, and he met her, and they kissed in the October light, briefly and completely. And it was not at all tentative and not at all dramatic, but simply and entirely real, the way the best things are. They went back to Redemption before winter closed the higher roads, because Alina needed help through the fall, and Thomas had, by this point, offered Owen the foreman's position vacated by a man who had left for Colorado. And Owen had accepted it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found work that is honest and physical, and requires the full range of his abilities, without requiring him to be something he was trying not to be anymore. He was good at it. The hands respected him within a week, because he did not manage from a distance but worked alongside them, and because he was very good with horses, and because he was quiet and level and consistent in his expectations, which was what good ranch management was. Delia began, that winter, to understand what she wanted to do that was visible and useful. She wrote letters to Garrett, detailed and precise letters containing everything she could remember about Voss's operations, and the other names Franklin had mentioned over the years, names she had filed away without knowing why. She wrote to women in Carson City and Reno, whose names Garrett had given her, women who had their own stories and their own documents, and she organized their accounts and packaged them in a form that was useful to a legal process. She was, Garrett told her in a letter, the most effective unpaid paralegal he had encountered in 15 years of practice. She was also, that winter, entirely and increasingly happy in a way that was specific and not general, rooted in particular things, in the sound of Owen coming in from the cold at the end of the day, in the conversations they had at Alina's kitchen table about anything and everything, in the way he looked at her across a room when he thought she wasn't watching, with the completely unguarded warmth that was still, 6 months on, capable of stopping her mid-sentence. He asked her to marry him in February, in the middle of a snowstorm that had locked the ranch in for 3 days, with no ceremony and no prepared speech, simply looking up from the fire where he was reading and saying, "I want us to be married. I want to ask you properly, but I cannot seem to think of a better way to say it than directly." And she had said, from the chair across from him where she was writing letters, "Yes, that is a better way to say it. Directly is always better." They were married in April, in Redemption's small church, with a minister who had a cold and apologized for it throughout the ceremony, and Alina who cried in the way of women who had been worrying about their sisters for a long time and were now relieved, and Thomas who shook Owen's hand with both of his and said, "I am glad you stopped on that road," because Delia had told them the whole story over the winter, and Owen had said, "So am I." Every day. The legal case against Voss took longer than Garrett had originally hoped, because these things always did, but it moved forward with the steady, inevitable momentum of a process that had enough evidence and enough will behind it. The federal charges were filed in June. 3 of the 6 other property owners, whose cases were connected to the fraud, had their original contracts reviewed and found fraudulent by the same mechanism as Delia's. By August, Voss's lawyer was negotiating terms, which was the behavior of lawyers who knew their client was cornered. Delia was called to Cheyenne twice to give depositions. Both times Owen came with her. The second time, Garrett took them both to dinner and said, "This is not going to give you everything back. The business was sold while the investigation was pending, which complicates the recovery. But the house, the original house in Carson City, I believe we can get that returned." The house in Carson City did not feel like the lost thing to her anymore. The lost thing had been found on a road outside Harrow Flats, which was not the kind of thing you said in a deposition. But she was glad for Franklin that his carelessness was being addressed. She was glad for the other women whose cases were connected. She was glad that the 60-day clause, which he had included in his contract, because he was a careful businessman even when he was not a careful husband, had turned out to matter after all. By the time the first winter of their marriage arrived, Delia was certain she was pregnant, and she was correct. She told Owen on a clear November morning, standing at the kitchen window of the small house they had built in the spring, on a portion of Thomas and Eleanor's land that Thomas had sold them at a price that was more gift than sale. Owen stood very still for a moment, in the specific way he had, and then turned from the window toward her with an expression she had not seen before, something so open and bright it was almost overwhelming. "A boy or a girl?" he said, which was not a question. "I do not know yet," she said. "I hope for a boy," he said. "To start." "To start," she agreed. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, in an exact order that was entirely his. And she put her hands over his, and they stood like that in the November light of their kitchen for a long and unhurried moment. The boy arrived in July of 1878, in the heat of a Wyoming summer, delivered by the town's doctor who was competent and fast, and informed them immediately that he was large and healthy and had an opinion about things, which he expressed with a vigor that suggested he was going to be expressive in perpetuity. Owen held him with the careful, complete attention he gave to everything important and looked at the small red face and said nothing for a moment that was longer than usual even for him. "James," Delia said. It was the name they had agreed on. She watched Owen's face as he looked at their son. "James," he said quietly, as if confirming something. The Voss case concluded formally in October of 1878, with a guilty verdict on the fraud charges and a civil judgment that resulted in the return of 3 properties and financial settlements for the other victims whose properties could not be directly recovered. The house in Carson City was returned to Delia, who sold it 6 months later and used the proceeds to purchase a proper parcel of land adjacent to the ranch and to build a house that was, by redemption standards, ambitious in its proportions and entirely her own design. Garrett sent a letter that said, "You were the reason this happened. The documents were the lever and your witness was the mechanism. 6 families got something back because of what you did. I hope you know that." She read the letter to Owen at the kitchen table, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hand, and when she finished he said, "I knew it, from the moment you told me about that envelope, the way you held on to it." "I did not know what was in it," she said. "No," he said. "But you held on to it, that matters." She thought about that, about the instinct of holding on. She looked at the man across the table, the man who had stopped his horse on a road and said something that was both the plainest and the most consequential thing that had happened to her. And she thought that holding on to the right things was, in the end, most of what survival required. James took his first steps in the kitchen of the new house in April of 1879, toward his father's outstretched hands, with the particular fierce determination of a child who had decided he was going to do this thing regardless of how many times the floor had recently proved It was not to be trusted. Owen caught him at the end of the 7 steps and lifted him and looked at Delia with a joy so uncomplicated and pure that she had to look away from it for a moment. Not because it was too much, but because it was exactly the right amount, and that required a second to absorb. She was pregnant again by that fall. She told Owen with the ease of someone for whom this was now a familiar kind of news, and he received it with the same contained brightness, and she said, "A girl this time, I think," because something felt different, more interior, more patient somehow, and she was correct. Margaret arrived in May of 1880, quieter from the first moment than James had been, with dark eyes that looked at everything with an intentional focus that was immediately recognizable to anyone who knew her father. Owen held her and said, "She is looking at me as if she is already working something out." And Delia said, "She is your daughter," and he laughed, which was a full laugh, unguarded and warm, and James, who was almost 2 and had an opinion about new developments in his household, reached up and put his hand on Owen's knee with the gravity of someone accepting a significant change. Owen Vance, former gunfighter, former bodyguard to men he was not proud of, man of the open road and the dark past and the scarred hand, had become a Wyoming rancher, a husband, a father of 2. He wore the same hat. He kept the same guns, cleaned and locked in the cabinet above the door, because it was the Wild West in 1880 and practical was practical. He still scanned ridges from habit, and still positioned himself with his back to walls, and probably always would, because some things written into the body by long practice are not entirely unwritable. But he came home every evening. He was present, entirely and specifically present, in the way that Delia had not known a man could be present in a shared life, not absent in the ways Franklin had been absent, not somewhere else inside himself. He argued with her sometimes, because she had opinions and expressed them directly, and he had his own and did the same. And these arguments were clean and finished and left nothing behind. He had written to his cousin in Montana in the first winter of their marriage, explaining the change in his plans. His cousin, a man named Bill who appeared to find life's surprises more amusing than alarming, had written back, "I had a feeling. Come up when you can. Bring your wife. The Yellowstone is worth seeing." They went in the summer of 1881, taking the children by train to the railhead and hiring a wagon from there, through country that grew wilder and more extravagant as it went north. Mountains with snow on them in July, rivers that were impractically beautiful, sky that went on past the reasonable definition of sky into something that required a new word. Bill was large and ruddy and exactly as delighted by them as his letters had suggested, and his wife June was a woman of particular directness and wit who took one look at Delia and said, "So you are the one who finally stopped him running?" And Delia said, "We stopped each other," and June said, "Good. The best ones always do." They spent 2 weeks on the Yellowstone, and on the last evening, sitting outside the ranch house with the mountains lit pink by the setting sun, and the children asleep inside and the sound of the river in the distance. Owen took her hand and held it and said nothing for a long while, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned that his silences were not empty, and eventually he said, "This is what I was looking for when I left Texas." "Did you know what it was?" she asked. "No," he said. "That is the trouble. You cannot know what you are looking for until you find it." She thought about a road outside a nothing town called Harrow Flats, about a carpetbag and a bruised jaw, and a man on a black horse appearing from a ridge she hadn't noticed. About the pure, terrifying odds of any specific life intersecting with any other specific life, and the extraordinary improbability that this had happened the way it did. "I was not looking for anything," she said. I was just trying to get somewhere. And did you? He said. She looked at him in the Montana evening light. This man she knew completely and loved with the whole of herself. And she thought about James asleep inside with Margaret curled against him, and the house in redemption with the ambitious proportions that were entirely her design, and Alina and Thomas 20 miles down the road, and Garrett's letter in the box with the other important papers, and the envelope that had changed everything because she had held onto it without knowing why. "Yes," she said, "I did." He lifted her hand and kissed it, on the scar-free side, and kept holding it, and the pink light moved on the mountains, and the river ran in the distance, and the evening came on with the patience of something that has all the time it needs, and they sat in it together, arrived, whole and entirely home.